There are thresholds in your life that you only recognize in retrospect. They aren't grand, arched doorways flanked by stone lions. They are often nothing more than a subtle shift in the quality of the silence, a change in the air pressure of a room. They are the moments when the entire landscape of your future is redrawn by a single, quiet gesture. For me, that threshold was the space of 6 inches on a worn leather sofa, a space filled with the heat of a body I knew as well as my own, and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of a hand finally closing the distance. It was the moment before the world changed, suspended in the amber of a dim lamplight, and I was holding my breath, waiting to see if I would be allowed to exhale on the other side. It began, as most things between Alex and me did, without words. He was asleep, or at least pretending to be, his head resting on the arm of my sofa, his long frame folded into the cramped space. His soccer practice had run late, a grueling session under the relentless autumn rain, and he'd shown up at my door an hour past midnight, dripping and exhausted, muttering something about his own apartment feeling too empty. This had become a familiar pattern in the weeks since his breakup. My apartment, a small, second-floor walk-up filled with the scent of darkroom chemicals and drying photo paper, had somehow become his sanctuary. And I, the quiet observer behind the lens, had become his keeper. His breath was a slow, steady rhythm in the quiet room, a metronome marking the passage of my own anxious thoughts. I was sitting on the floor, my back against a bookshelf, pretending to read, but the words on the page were a meaningless blur. Every nerve in my body was attuned to him, to the subtle twitch of his fingers, the soft sigh that escaped his lips. The air was thick with everything we never said, a lifetime of unspoken affection on my part, and a deep, churning need on his that he couldn't yet name. He shifted, a restless movement that brought his hand dangling off the edge of the cushion, inches from my own. And in that space, that tiny, charged emptiness, the entire history of us seemed to hang in the balance. We had met in college, a collision of two completely different orbits. I was the quiet art student, the one who lived in the library and the darkroom, communicating more. Our meeting was an accident of university housing. His designated study partner dropped a class, and I was assigned to take his place for a mandatory literature seminar we were both dreading. He'd slumped into the chair opposite me in the library, smelling of cut grass and exertion, and given me a weary, apologetic smile that somehow bypassed all my usual defenses. He thought I would be annoyed, another academic hurdle in a schedule packed with training. But I wasn't. I was just captivated. Our friendship was forged in the crucible of late-night study sessions fueled by bad coffee and a shared sense of academic desperation. He struggled with thematic analysis, and I struggled with speaking to another human being for more than 5 consecutive minutes. We were, in a strange way, perfect for each other. I would help him unravel the dense symbolism in Faulkner, and he, in turn, would coax me out of my shell, dragging me to team dinners or post-game celebrations where I would stand awkwardly in a corner, clutching a drink and observing. He never pushed too hard. He seemed to understand my boundaries intuitively, creating a space for me at the edge of his vibrant world where I could feel included without feeling overwhelmed. He called me his calm center, the person he came to when the noise of his own life became too much. For me, he was a window to a world of effortless connection I'd only ever watched from a distance. I photographed his games, not for the school paper, but for myself. I learned to anticipate the exact moment he would leap for a header, the focused intensity in his eyes just before a shot, the unadulterated joy of a goal. My camera allowed me to stare, to study him in a way that would have been impossible otherwise. It was my shield and my confessional. Through my lens, I could love him safely. The realization of the true depth of my feelings wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow development, like a photograph emerging in a chemical bath. It was in the small, insignificant moments. The way I'd find myself saving the last of the good coffee for him, just in case he stopped by. The pang of disappointment I'd feel when he'd mention a date with some girl I knew I would never measure up to. The proprietary warmth that would bloom in my chest when he'd throw an arm around my shoulders and introduce me to someone as his best friend, Leo. The word friend always felt both like a comfort and a cage. It was a precious, vital connection I was terrified of losing, and at the same time, It was a boundary line I yearned to cross. I buried my feelings deep, building walls of plausible deniability around my heart. My affection was reframed as loyalty. My longing was disguised as concern. I became an expert in the art of emotional camouflage, convinced that the slightest misstep, the smallest crack in my facade, would shatter the delicate ecosystem of our friendship. He was with Sarah for the last 2 years of college and the 3 years after. I liked her truly. She was kind and smart, and she made him happy. I learned to perform the role of the supportive best friend flawlessly. I helped him pick out anniversary gifts. I listened to him vent about their minor squabbles. I smiled and toasted their happiness at parties, all while a quiet, persistent ache settled into my bones. I told myself it was enough. To be in his orbit, to be the one he trusted, to be his calm center, it had to be enough. Then, one Tuesday in October, it wasn't. The call came at 2 in the morning. I was half asleep, surrounded by the faint, acidic smell of fixer solution still clinging to my clothes. His voice on the other end was rough, broken in a way I had never heard before. It was just 2 words. She's gone. He didn't have to say who. I told him to stay put, that I was coming. I found him sitting on the front steps of the apartment he had shared with Sarah, his head in his hands, a single unpacked box beside him. The city lights blurred around him, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to cling to his slumped shoulders. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of his usual kinetic energy, as if the strings that held him together had been cut. He didn't say much as I drove him back to my place. He just stared out the passenger window, his reflection a ghostly overlay on the passing streetlights. The silence in the car was heavy, a dense, suffocating blanket of grief. When we got to my apartment, he walked straight to the sofa and collapsed onto it, curling into himself like a child. I didn't know what to do. All my carefully constructed walls, all my practiced emotional distance, felt useless in the face of such raw, immediate pain. So I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled the worn Afghan off the back of my armchair and draped it over him. His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes, when he looked up at me, were swimming with a terrifying mixture of despair and panic. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, just stay." So I stayed. I sat on the floor beside the sofa, just as I was doing now, months later, and listened to the ragged sound of his breathing until it finally deepened into a troubled sleep. That night marked the shift. It was the catalyst that dissolved the old boundaries and began to draw new, uncertain lines. My apartment ceased to be just my home. It became his refuge. He started staying over a few nights a week, always with a plausible excuse. His place was too quiet, too full of ghosts. He couldn't sleep in that bed alone. My sofa was surprisingly comfortable. I never questioned it. I just made sure there was always milk for his morning cereal, and I kept the Afghan clean. I told myself I was just being a good friend, that anyone would do the same. But deep down, I knew this was different. I was letting him in, not just into my apartment, but into the quiet, carefully guarded spaces of my daily life. And with every night he spent on my sofa, the line between friendship and something more began to blur into an intoxicating, terrifying haze. The first time he crossed the physical threshold of my bedroom, it felt like a seismic event. It was about a month after the breakup. He'd been quiet all evening, staring blankly at a soccer match on television, his food untouched. The silence in the apartment was different that night, not the comfortable quiet we usually shared, but a tense, brittle thing. Around midnight, I said goodnight and retreated to my room, leaving him on the sofa as usual. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar city sounds outside my window. I couldn't sleep. I could feel his restlessness through the wall, a low hum of anxiety that seemed to seep into my own bones. An hour passed. Then I heard it, the soft creak of the floorboards in the hallway, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat. A shadow fell under my door. A soft knock, barely audible. "Leo." His voice was small. "You awake?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "Yeah," I managed to say, my own voice tight. The door creaked open, just a few inches. He stood in the sliver of light from the hallway, a tall silhouette of uncertainty. He looked lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know this is weird. I can't sleep. The quiet is too loud. Do you mind if I just sit in here for a bit? On the floor? I won't bother you," The request was so strange, so vulnerable, that it disarmed me completely. My mind was screaming 1,000 warnings. This is dangerous. This is a line. But my heart, that foolish, hopeful traitor, simply ached for him. Okay, I heard myself say. Sure, Alex. It's okay. He slipped into the room, closing the door softly behind him, plunging us into near darkness, save for the faint orange glow of a streetlight filtering through the blinds. He didn't sit. He lay down on the small rug at the foot of my bed, pulling one of my discarded sweatshirts under his head as a pillow. He was a few feet away, but his presence filled the entire room. I could hear every breath he took. I could smell the faint scent of my laundry detergent on his clothes. We lay there in the shared darkness for what felt like an eternity, two bodies in a small room, separated by a few feet of floor and a universe of unspoken things. Finally, his breathing evened out. He was asleep, and I was left wide awake, my heart aching with a tenderness so profound it felt like a wound. That night, the ritual began. It wasn't every night, at first. It was sporadic, happening only on his worst nights, the ones where the ghosts of his past relationship seemed to haunt him most acutely. He would appear at my door, a phantom of grief and exhaustion, and ask in a hushed whisper if he could sleep on my floor. I always said yes. I learned the topography of his sleeping form in the dim light, the way one arm was always thrown over his eyes, the way his feet would twitch in the midst of a dream. I learned to sleep through the sound of his soft snores, a sound that should have been an intrusion but instead became a strange sort of lullaby, a confirmation that he was here, that he was safe. My bedroom, my most private sanctuary, was no longer just my own. It had become a shared space, a holding cell for our mutual loneliness and my secret, burgeoning hope. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just a temporary arrangement born of his desperation and my loyalty. It was a story I repeated to myself every morning as I watched him slip out of my room before the sun was fully up, a silent agreement to pretend the night had never happened. But then, the ritual began to evolve. One night, a particularly cold one in late November, he came to my door shivering. He'd forgotten a blanket, and the sweatshirt he was using as a pillow offered little warmth. He lay on the floor for an hour, his teeth chattering softly in the darkness, a sound that went straight through me. I couldn't stand it. Alex, I whispered into the dark. He mumbled something in response. Get up, I said, my voice firmer than I intended. You're going to freeze down there. Just get in the bed. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt him tense on the floor. I thought I had gone too far, that I had finally shattered the fragile, unspoken rules of our arrangement. I don't know, he said, his voice thick with sleep and something else I couldn't identify. I don't want to intrude. The irony of his words was so sharp it almost made me laugh. He was already in my room, in my life, in my head, in my heart. The bed was just a few more feet of territory. It's a big bed, I lied. It was a standard double, not nearly big enough. And you're an idiot if you think I'm going to let you get sick on my floor. Get in. I heard him hesitate for another moment, and then the sound of him rising. The mattress dipped as he slid under the covers on the far side, keeping as much distance between us as possible. He lay ramrod straight, his body a rigid line of tension. Thank you, he murmured to the ceiling. The first night he slept in my bed was an exercise in exquisite torture. I was hyper-aware of everything. The heat radiating from his body, a tantalizing warmth that my own skin craved, the clean scent of his hair on the pillow next to mine, the subtle shift of the mattress every time he moved. I lay on my side, facing away from him, my muscles locked, my breathing shallow. I was terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too deeply, I would betray the frantic, chaotic symphony of my feelings. I felt like a fraud, offering comfort with one hand while my heart was secretly screaming with a desperate, selfish want. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night suspended in a state of heightened awareness, cataloging every sensory detail, every nuance of his proximity. When dawn finally broke, painting the room in soft shades of gray, I felt him stir. He slipped out of bed with the same quiet stealth he always did, but before he left the room, he hesitated at the door. I kept my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep. I heard him whisper, so softly I wasn't sure I hadn't imagined it. Thanks, Leo. Then he was gone. From that night on, the floor was no longer an option. The new ritual was the bed. He would still knock, would still ask, his voice always laced with a carefully maintained note of apology, as if he were asking for the first time. And I would always say yes. We developed an unspoken choreography. He would take the side of the bed closest to the door. I would take the side by the window. We would lie on our backs, or facing away from each other, a careful, deliberate chasm of inches between us. We rarely spoke once the lights were out. The darkness became our confessional, a space where his need for proximity and my need for him could coexist without the harsh scrutiny of the daylight. The anxiety of that first night never fully dissipated for me, but it was joined by something else, a deep, profound sense of rightness. Having him there, close enough to hear him breathe, felt like a missing piece of my life clicking into place. I started to see our arrangement not as a temporary measure of his grief, but as a fragile, secret world we were building together, one quiet night at a time. I was living a double life. By day, I was his best friend, the steady, reliable rock. By night, I was the silent keeper of his sleep, the guardian of his nightmares, a man hopelessly in love with the warm, breathing presence in his bed. I was terrified of when it would end. Every night he knocked, I felt a surge of relief. Every morning he left, I felt a pang of fear. I was living on borrowed time, in a borrowed intimacy, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was destined to break my heart. The nature of his touch began to change, too, incrementally at first, so subtly that I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. It started outside the bedroom. He'd always been a physically affectionate friend, in that casual, non-threatening way athletes often are. A slap on the back, a quick one-armed hug after a goal, an arm slung over my shoulder in a crowded bar. But this was different. The gestures became softer, more lingering. He would let his hand rest on my arm for a moment too long when he was making a point. He would lean against me on the sofa while we watched a movie, his head eventually finding its way to my shoulder. Each instance was a small test, a tiny push against the boundaries we had always maintained. I was a cartographer of his touch, mapping out the new terrain of our relationship. I analyzed every gesture, searching for intent, for meaning. Was this just an extension of his need for comfort, a platonic gesture from a man starved for physical reassurance? Or was it something more? My mind and my heart were at war. My mind, the cautious pragmatist, warned me not to read into it, to protect myself from the inevitable fall. But my heart, the reckless optimist, saw a glimmer of possibility, a suggestion that perhaps my one-sided love was not so one-sided after all. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday. We had been cooped up in the apartment all day, the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window pane a soothing backdrop to our comfortable silence. I was editing photos on my laptop, and he was sprawled on the sofa, ostensibly reading, but mostly just staring into space. The air was heavy with a kind of melancholic peace. He'd been quieter than usual for a few days, a thoughtful, inward-looking mood settling over him. He finally closed his book with a sigh and turned to look at me. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Can I see what you're working on?" I was surprised. He was always supportive of my photography, but he rarely took an active interest in the technical process of editing. I beckoned him over. He knelt beside my chair, his arm brushing against mine as he leaned in to look at the screen. I was working on a series of portraits I'd taken downtown, stark black and white images of strangers caught in moments of quiet contemplation. He was silent for a long time, just watching as I adjusted the contrast on an image of an old man sitting on a park bench. "You see things differently, you know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You see the things that people try to hide." His gaze shifted from the screen to me. His eyes, usually so bright and full of easy humor, were dark and serious. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in the brown of his irises. The moment stretched, thinning into something fragile and charged. He didn't move away. If anything, he leaned in closer, his breath warm against my cheek. My own breath hitched in my throat. This was it. This was a threshold. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the intensity in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a familiar, guarded friendliness. He cleared his throat and stood up, running a hand through his hair. "Those are really good, man," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too casual. "You're going to be famous one day." And then he retreated to the other side of the room. leaving me with the ghost of his warmth on my skin and a heart that was beating far too fast. He had stepped right up to the line, looked over it, and then deliberately stepped back. The question was, why? The weeks leading up to Christmas were a strange paradox of intimacy and distance. The ritual of the nights continued, a constant, reassuring presence in the darkness. We slept side by side, our bodies sometimes brushing against each other in the night, an accidental touch that would send a jolt of electricity through my entire system. But during the day, he was more withdrawn than ever. The easy physical affection, the lingering touches, they all but disappeared. He seemed to be building his walls back up, even as he continued to seek refuge within mine every night. It was confusing and painful. I felt like I was being given a precious gift every night, only to have it snatched away every morning. I was trapped in a liminal space, somewhere between friend and something more, and the uncertainty was starting to wear me down. I found myself becoming irritable, my patience thinning. I wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation, to force him to name the strange, shapeless thing that was growing between us. But I didn't. I held my tongue, terrified that a single word would shatter the fragile peace and send him running for good. So I waited. I watched. And I hoped. It was 2 days before Christmas. He was supposed to go to his parents' house, but a freak snowstorm had blanketed the city, canceling all flights and trains. His family was disappointed, but I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, relief. We were snowed in. The city outside went silent, muffled under a thick blanket of white. My apartment felt like a snow globe, a tiny, self-contained world cut off from everything else. We spent the day in a state of relaxed domesticity, drinking hot chocolate, watching old movies, and occasionally just staring out the window at the falling snow. The tension that had been humming between us for weeks seemed to have dissolved, replaced by a quiet, comfortable sense of inevitability. As night fell, the power flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness lit only by the eerie, reflected glow of the snow outside and the few emergency candles I managed to find. "Well," he said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "This is cozy." He was sitting on the sofa, and I was on the floor, my back against the cushions near his legs. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small room feel both intimate and immense. We were quiet for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the weight of the last few months, of all the nights spent in shared darkness, of all the things we had painstakingly avoided saying. I could feel his gaze on me, a tangible pressure. I turned my head to look up at him. His face was half in shadow, his expression unreadable but intense. He looked like he was on the verge of saying something important, something that would change everything. He spoke, and his voice was so low I had to strain to hear it over the wind. "Leo." I just looked at him, unable to form a word. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I'm not sure about this," he said, and the words were a punch to the gut. A cold dread washed over me. This was it. He was going to end it. He was going to tell me he couldn't do this anymore, that it was too weird, that he was going back to his own apartment, back to his own life, leaving me alone in the ruins of the secret world we had built. I braced myself for the impact, for the familiar sting of rejection. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to make it easier for him, to tell him it was okay, that I understood. But he didn't give me the chance. He leaned down, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were moving through water. He brought his face close to mine, his eyes searching my own in the flickering candlelight, seeking permission, or perhaps absolution. And then he closed the remaining distance. He kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was tentative, questioning, a soft pressure of his lips against mine. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was 1,000 questions asked in a single, silent gesture. His words, "I'm not sure about this," echoed in my mind, a stark contradiction to the undeniable reality of his lips on mine. And then, as if my own stillness had given him the answer he was looking for, the pressure deepened. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking softly against my skin. And he kissed me like he was sure. He kissed me with a certainty that belied all his confusion, with a gentle, yearning hunger that spoke of months of buried feelings and unspoken desires. He kissed me like he had wanted to do it for a very long time. And in that moment, All my fear, all my anxiety, all my carefully constructed walls, they all just melted away, leaving behind only the raw, unguarded truth of my love for him. I kissed him back. I poured every ounce of my silent, patient affection into that kiss. Every late night, I had lain awake listening to him breathe. Every photograph I had ever taken of him. Every hopeful, foolish prayer I had ever whispered into the darkness. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. It was a threshold crossed, not with a bang, but with a quiet, reverent sigh. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. The candlelight danced on his face, illuminating the sheen of tears on his lashes. "Leo," he whispered, and my name on his lips sounded like a prayer. The world outside was silent, buried in snow. And inside our tiny, candlelit snow globe, a new world had just begun. The aftermath was not the explosion of clarity I might have hoped for. It was a quiet, trembling confusion. We didn't talk about it. Not that night. After the kiss, a profound shyness descended upon us. He stood up, his movements stiff and uncertain, and walked to my bedroom. He paused at the door and looked back at me, his expression a tangled mess of hope and fear. It was an invitation. I followed him. That night, for the first time, when we got into bed, the space between us disappeared. He turned on his side to face me, and I mirrored him. In the dim, snow-reflected light, I could see the conflict raging in his eyes. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before tangling with my own. His hand was warm and strong, and his grip was tight, as if he were afraid I might disappear. We fell asleep like that, hands clasped between us, a silent, fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. But the morning light brought with it a harsh return to reality. When I woke up, he was gone. Not just from the bed, but from the apartment. A set of footprints in the fresh snow leading away from my building was the only evidence he had been there at all. A cold, heavy dread began to pool in my stomach. He avoided me for 3 days. 3 days of agonizing silence. My calls went to voicemail. My texts were left unread, 2 stark blue check marks on a screen that mocked my anxiety. The apartment, which had felt like a sanctuary just a few nights before, now felt like a prison. Every object, every surface, seemed to hold a memory of him. The Afghan on the armchair, the empty mug by the sink, the indentation his head had left on the pillow next to mine. I was adrift in a sea of his absence. My mind replayed the kiss over and over again, analyzing it from every possible angle. Had I imagined the certainty? Had I misinterpreted the tenderness? His words, "I'm not sure about this," became a cruel mantra, taunting me. Maybe he was right. Maybe he wasn't sure. Maybe the kiss had been a mistake, a moment of snowstorm-induced madness, a desperate grasp for comfort that he now deeply regretted. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest just a few days ago began to wither and die, replaced by the familiar, bitter taste of resignation. I had let myself believe, just for a moment, and now I was paying the price. I had risked our friendship, the most stable and precious thing in my life, for a single, fleeting moment of impossible beauty. And it seemed I had lost everything. On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The passive waiting, the silent torment, it was eating me alive. I knew I had to face him. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I walked to his apartment, the cold winter air biting at my face. The snow had been cleared from the sidewalks, leaving behind dirty, gray slush that mirrored the state of my own heart. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my hand hovering over the buzzer, my courage failing me. What if he didn't answer? What if he did, and he looked at me with pity, or worse, with disgust? I finally forced myself to press the button, the shrill sound echoing in the empty hallway. I heard movement inside, and then the sound of the chain being unlatched. The door opened a crack. He stood there, looking haggard. He hadn't shaved, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was still in his pajamas, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. He didn't look surprised to see me. He just looked tired, resigned. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. He didn't open the door any wider. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice sounding steadier than I felt. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed and stepped back, letting me into the apartment. The air inside was stale. The box he had brought from Sarah's place still sat by the door, now joined by a few others. The place felt transient, unlived in. It wasn't a home. It was a waiting room. He didn't look at me. He just walked over to the window and stood with his back to me, staring out at the bleak winter landscape. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I was the one who finally broke it. "Are you going to talk to me?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Or are you just going to hide in here forever?" He flinched, but he didn't turn around. "I don't know what to say, Leo. You could start with why you ran," I said, taking a step closer. "You could start by telling me what that kiss meant. Or did it mean nothing? Was I just convenient? A warm body on a cold night." The words tasted like acid in my mouth, but I couldn't stop them. The hurt and anger I had been suppressing for days came pouring out. "Because if that's all it was, Alex, you need to tell me. You owe me that much." He finally turned around, and his face was a mask of anguish. "Of course it wasn't nothing," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't you know that? Don't you know me at all?" "I thought I did," I shot back. "But the person I know wouldn't kiss me like that, and then disappear for 3 days without a word. The person I know wouldn't leave me feeling like the world's biggest fool." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, pacing the small space between the window and the sofa. I freaked out, okay? I freaked out. "Why?" I demanded. "Why, Alex? What are you so afraid of?" He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Of this. Of what this means. For me. For you. For everything. Leo, my entire life, I've had a plan. You know? College, job, get married to a woman like Sarah, have kids, a house. It was all laid out. A straight line. And you're not on that line. You were never supposed to be on that line." The words were clumsy, hurtful, but I could hear the genuine panic beneath them. He wasn't trying to wound me. He was trying to explain the chaos in his own head. He saw his life as a neat, architectural blueprint, and I was an element that didn't fit, an anomaly that threatened to bring the whole structure crashing down. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice dropping, the anger draining out of me, leaving only a vast, hollow emptiness. "I'm just a complication, a deviation from the plan." "No," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "No, you're not. You're the only thing that's felt real in months. Since Sarah left, everything has felt gray, muted, like I was watching my own life from a distance. But when I'm with you, in your apartment, the colors come back. And that night, in the dark, with the snow falling, it was the first time I felt peace. The first time I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." He took a deep breath, the confession tumbling out of him in a rush. "And that scares the hell out of me. Because I've spent my whole life being one thing and feeling this for you. It makes me feel like I don't know who I am anymore. I'm not gay, Leo." The words hung in the air between us, a desperate, clumsy attempt at self-preservation. I felt a fresh wave of hurt, but it was quickly replaced by a weary sort of clarity. "Stop it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Stop trying to put a label on it. Stop trying to fit it into one of your neat little boxes. I don't care what you call it. I don't care if you're gay or straight or anything in between. All I care about is what you feel, what we have. And you don't get to diminish it because it scares you. You don't get to use my heart as a temporary shelter from your own loneliness and then board it up when you start to feel something real." I walked towards him until I was standing right in front of him, forcing him to meet my gaze. "I have loved you for years, Alex. Silently, patiently. I have watched you love other people, and I have been happy for you because I wanted you to be happy. I have been your calm center, your friend, your keeper. And I would have done it forever, without ever asking for anything more. But you crossed the line. You kissed me. You opened a door. And you don't get to just slam it in my face because you're scared of what's on the other side." He stared at me, his eyes wide, a storm of emotions passing over his face. He looked stunned, as if the force of my words had physically struck him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, I thought he was going to push me away, to retreat back into his fear and his confusion. But he didn't. Instead, his carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and a sound that was half sob, half laugh escaped his lips. He reached out and pulled me into a hug, burying his face in my shoulder. His body was trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered into my jacket, his voice muffled. "God, Leo, I'm so sorry. I'm such an idiot. I'm so scared." I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly. The tension that had been coiled in my own body for days finally began to release. He wasn't pushing me away. He was clinging to me. I know, I said, my own voice thick with emotion. It's okay to be scared. But you're not alone in it. We stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the middle of his sterile, temporary apartment. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a neat and tidy resolution. But it was a start. It was an admission. It was the truth, finally laid bare between us. And it was enough. The days that followed were tentative, like the first thaw of a long winter. We talked. For the first time, we really talked. Not about literature or soccer or the weather, but about us. Alex spoke about his fear, his confusion, his deeply ingrained expectations for his own life, and the terror of letting them go. He admitted that his feelings for me weren't new, that they had been there for a long time, a quiet undercurrent beneath the surface of our friendship that he had deliberately ignored, unable and unwilling to examine it too closely. His relationship with Sarah, he confessed, had been as much about following the pre-written script as it had been about love. Being with her was safe. It was expected. It was the path of least resistance. My role as his best friend was also a safe, clearly defined box. The breakup had shattered all of that, leaving him adrift, and in his desperation, he had clung to the one thing that had always felt constant and true, me. The physical proximity, the nights in my bed, had started as a simple need for comfort, but had quickly morphed into something else, something deeper and more undeniable, until the night of the snowstorm, when the unspoken had finally become unbearable. Listening to him, I felt a profound sense of empathy. I had spent years hiding my own feelings, so I understood the fear of confronting a truth that could upend your entire world. His journey was different from mine, but the fear was the same. We began to build a new foundation, not on the unspoken assumptions of our old friendship, but on the fragile, honest ground of our shared feelings. It was a slow, delicate process of discovery. We learned to navigate the new landscape of our relationship, finding a new language for our intimacy. There were still moments of awkwardness, of uncertainty. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with a flicker of panic in his eyes, the ghost of his old fears resurfacing. In those moments, I learned not to push, but to be patient, to offer a quiet, reassuring touch, a small smile that said, "I'm still here. We're okay." He moved back into my apartment, but this time it was different. It wasn't a temporary refuge. It was a conscious choice. We were building a home together. The sofa he had once slept on became the place we would curl up together to watch movies, his head in my lap, my fingers tracing patterns on his arm. The ritual of the nights changed, too. There was no more knocking, no more hesitant requests. He would simply come to bed when he was ready, slipping under the covers and finding me in the darkness. The space between us was gone, replaced by a comfortable, easy closeness. Sometimes we would talk for hours, whispering secrets and dreams in the dark. Other nights, we would just hold each other, finding solace in the simple, profound comfort of another's presence. One evening, about a month after our confrontation, I was developing photos in my darkroom, which was really just a converted bathroom. The red safe light cast an eerie, beautiful glow over everything. Alex came and stood in the doorway, watching me. He had learned not to open the door all the way, to respect the sanctity of the light-sensitive space. He just leaned against the frame, a silent, comforting presence. I was working on a portrait of him, one I had taken a few days earlier. He was sitting on the windowsill, looking out at the city, a thoughtful, peaceful expression on his face. It was one of the best photographs I had ever taken. As the image slowly emerged in the developer tray, a ghostly apparition firming into reality, he spoke. "It's still weird sometimes," he said, his voice soft in the small, dark space. In my head, I still hear that old voice telling me this is wrong, that this isn't the plan. I stopped agitating the tray and looked at him. His face was bathed in the deep red light, his features softened. "And what do you do with that voice?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I tell it to shut up," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "And then I think about this. About you. About how it feels when you're asleep and you roll over and throw your arm over me. About the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention." And I realized the plan was stupid. It wasn't a plan for a life. It was a plan for a story someone else wrote. He pushed himself off the doorframe and came over to me, carefully navigating the small space. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder, and looking down at the photograph emerging in the tray. "This," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "This is real. This is our story." In the dim, red light of my darkroom, surrounded by the scent of chemicals and the quiet magic of a memory taking form, I felt a sense of peace so deep and profound it almost brought me to my knees. The fear was gone. The uncertainty was gone. All that was left was the simple, beautiful truth of us. The final, symbolic piece clicked into place a few weeks later. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, but it felt momentous. We had just gotten into bed. It was a normal weeknight, quiet and unremarkable. He had been reading on his side of the bed while I finished up some work. When I finally slid under the covers, he put his book down and turned off his bedside lamp. He rolled over to face me and kissed me, a soft, sleepy, goodnight kiss that had already become a cherished part of our new ritual. Then he reached over and pulled me closer, tucking my head under his chin, his arms wrapping securely around me. I felt him sigh, a deep, contented sound that vibrated through his chest. And then he did something he had never done before. Every other night since he had started staying with me, all those months ago, the bedroom door had been left slightly ajar. It was an unspoken habit, a remnant of his initial intrusion, a symbol of the temporary, transient nature of his presence. It was a subconscious escape route, a way of signaling that he wasn't fully committed to the space. But tonight, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a soft click. I opened my eyes. He had reached out a long arm and had quietly, deliberately, pulled the door shut, engaging the latch. The room was now a sealed, private world. Our world. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a final closing of the door on his old life, on his old fears. It was a statement of intent. It was the quiet, definitive sound of him choosing to stay. We learn to measure our lives not in years, but in the moments that redefine our understanding of home. Home is not a place with four walls and a roof, but a feeling of safety, of being seen and accepted for exactly who you are. It is the quiet harbor where you can anchor your heart after a long and difficult journey. For years, I had thought my love for Alex was a secret I had to guard, a fragile thing that would shatter if exposed to the light. But I was wrong. It was not a weakness. It was a compass. It was the steady, patient force that guided us both through the wilderness of our own fears and insecurities. He had come to me seeking a temporary shelter, and in the process, we had ended up building a permanent home, not with bricks and mortar, but with whispered confessions in the dark, with patient understanding, and with the quiet, revolutionary courage to let go of the life we thought we were supposed to have in order to embrace the one that was waiting for us all along. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the profound, unspoken certainty of a love that had finally found its voice.